All right, guys, we'll wait again just kind of for a second or so for the sound to kick in. Usually should be good by about now. So welcome to Wednesday 5-6, right, in our series, and we're talking about plants today. Obviously, the link will be sent later, okay? Make sure that if you decide to do the optional chapter 17 guided reading, that you get that handed in today, okay? And then today's, again, kind of a work day, obviously. You've got the Unit 8 online review, those concept questions, 18.1, 18.3 you could be working on, or reviewing for tomorrow's quiz. So quiz tomorrow, and the online review is due tomorrow. And then with today's video lecture, I would actually recommend it. I'm just going to do it all as one. But, I don't think you guys should necessarily sit down and watch the whole thing through. It'll be a little longer of a video lecture, so I think it's certainly okay to kind of, today spend some time on it, spend maybe 15, 20 minutes on it, and then find a good cutoff point, stop, and then come back to it and finish it kind of tomorrow, because obviously this information on plants is not on your quiz tomorrow. The quiz on this information on plants is not until really next Wednesday, next week, okay? So I just simply saying that take kind of a break. Don't watch the whole lecture, I think, from beginning to end, and take notes on it from beginning to end. Break it up into little chunks and break it in half or so, okay? All right, so let's kind of jump in and get to plants today. So plants, right? We've been talking about kind of all these sort of different kingdoms and these different sort of living things on our planet, and we've had some discussion about plants this year, obviously in our discussion about photosynthesis, right? So photosynthesis earlier this year. And plants are not the only photosynthetic organism, but they are certainly sort of the largest and most numerous group in terms of photosynthetic organisms in terms of their biomass. And meaning, remember, biomass is like the dry weight of all the tissues that make up this particular group. And what makes them unique is that fact that they are photosynthetic and they can take sunlight, right? Here's my little sketch of the sun, right? Okay. And energy that we receive from the sun, and they're the bridge, right? They can take energy that we receive from the sun and put it into plant tissue, right? Here's a flower, right? And that plant tissue then can be consumed by, primary consumers and secondary and tertiary consumers, ultimately to us, right? And so if it's not for plants, if it's not for the sort of the health and maintenance of this particular group, really, kind of so goes all these living organisms that rely on being able to feed on plants either directly or indirectly. So you get the feel for really the importance of this particular group and how they kind of fit into the grand scheme of things, with how energy is really fixed and available to all forms of consumers on our planet. They are the bridge between unfixed, free energy and fixed energy that is used and consumed, and makes up, gives us our energy to do what we got to do every day, and then allows us to be able to maintain our own body's tissues, okay? So we'll start off with just some form and functional pieces and just sort of what plants look like, what are kind of the major kind of portions of their anatomy, if you will. So plants possess three main organs: the roots, the stems, and the leaves, okay? And that's kind of what separates them from like algae, and we'll make sort of a comparison of that later on. But roots, and here's sort of the big deal of this, is that what's happening is you have a situation where we starting to see within these particular living organisms a separation of jobs, right? Where jobs are given certain portions of the plant have different jobs, just like our bodies, right? Our arms have different jobs than our legs, right? Different organs within our different systems within our bodies have different jobs, but collectively they work to support the organism. it's kind of, this is sort of the first step that we start to see that a little bit further, highly specialized sort of organs, if you will, that have specific jobs. So the roots, right, they absorb nutrients and water from the soil. The stems, they support leaves and flowers, and they're going to support sort of the stalk of the plant, if you will. It helps to keep it upright. And it's going to provide the leaves to stay upright so they can do their photosynthesis, flowers for the purpose of reproduction. And they're going to, stems provide the transport. They're the bridge between leaves and roots, right? So if you think of a plant, here's the roots in the ground, there's the leaves and flowers up in the air, and the stem is the bridge between it, okay? It transports materials up and down from the roots to the leaves, and then carbohydrates and materials that are built in the leaves back to the roots, okay? And then leaves, like I said, the third part are the site for photosynthesis. Now, some other key parts, stomata, these are openings in leaves that allow for gas exchange. So actually, you know what I'm going to do? So hold on, before I talk stomata, I'm going to do this. So here's just sort of an image of what we just talked about. So here's the leaves, right? Including flowers. You don't have flowers drawn on this. The stem, okay, the stem right here, and then the root system. The leaves have different stomata on them, and then the stem and the root system will all have these vascular tissue that stretches, called specifically xylem and phloem, from roots to leaves, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Okay, so stomata, these are openings in the leaves that allow for gas exchange. Okay? So for CO2 and oxygen being exchanged for the purpose of photosynthesis, but also for the purpose of transpiration. So water loss also happens through these stomata. So stomata, you kind of get a sort of feel for this. A lot of times they're on the underside of the leaf. These are these sort of guard cells. Remember when we looked at the celery in the lab a little while ago? We saw these sort of guard cells that had kind of this sort of opening almost, okay, as we look down at them. Those openings, those were stomata, right? And these guard cells can kind of flex open and close to be able to protect from water loss. And again, they're usually on the lower edge of the leaf of the plant. And that's a preventative feature too, because if they're on the upper edge, you got more sunlight usually hitting the upper edge, greater temperature, greater amount of evaporation. On the lower edge, they're protected. By being protected from sunlight, they're going to prevent less water loss, okay? But these openings allow for gas exchange and some water loss and water exchange, and even some water gain too, okay? But these stomates are again typically on the underside for that reason. It's a evolutionary gain to be able to conserve water, right? And you'll see a little bit more about why that is, right? And then finally, next, vascular tissue. We kind of talked about this. So plants have to transport water and nutrients. They have vascular tissue called xylem and phloem, and now they're kind of part of the same. They're part of the same package in a way, and I have sort of an image that we'll look at in just a second. But this xylem and phloem stretches the distance from leaves to roots. But each portion of the vascular tissue has a different job. So xylem specifically will move water, and phloem will specifically move nutrients, like different dissolved minerals, from, say, leaves to roots or roots to leaves. Xylem will exclusively only transport water. Now, they kind of, again, these vascular bundles sort of appear together. So here's sort of an image of a vascular bundle, okay? And that sort of vascular bundle, so it's sort of blown up here. If you look in here at this sort of section here, okay, is the phloem, okay? And these larger pores and openings would all be xylem. So phloem here, and then xylem, these larger openings. And the xylem is the larger of the sort of openings within the vascular tissue, partly because plants have sort of the greatest requirement for water and movement of water. Okay, so the xylem is sort of a larger opening, if you will, within this vascular tissue for that purpose. Okay, so these vascular bundles have sort of two parts to it, and each part has a different job of transportation. Okay, let's see, I'm jumping around a little bit. Just double checking. All right, so here we go. So continuing on, the last couple things here. So apical meristems. Apical refers to, if you remember, we looked at like the apex of a triangle is the point of a triangle, right? So if you're looking at like a triangle here, that's the apex of the triangle. Remember when we looked at mitosis and onion cells when we were in the lab, we looked at the apical meristem of that onion, of those onion root tips. These are the apical meristem is located at the tips of stems and roots. And these are areas of continuous division for ultimately for growth. So this is where plants grow from. They don't grow from, they don't really grow from the internal portion. Where are they going to grow from? They're going to grow from the apical meristem or the tip of the stems, right? And they're going to build outwards, or the tips of these roots, right? And they're going to build outwards from there. So growth in terms of plant growth happens at those positions, those apical meristems. And then last couple things, pollen and seeds. So this is a big deal. Like one of the things in the living world in terms of being able to guarantee survival, right, from an evolutionary perspective, is to be able to guarantee reproduction, right? So one of the kind of the solutions within the living community of all living things is that there are a lot of living things that will reproduce in large amounts or produce large amounts of sex cells or large amounts of seeds for the purpose of hoping that at least some of them survive, right? So pollen is male sperm cells covered by a protective coat that can be dispersed by wind and pollinators. So lots of pollen is produced. And you have allergies. It's the springtime right now. I have allergies. I get the sniffles from it because of all these sort of plants that are producing pollen at this point. So wind and air, pollen is small enough that can be transported by wind, but also plants have a large reliance on pollinators. So pollination disperses these male sex cells from plant to plant, so it allows for cross-pollination. There are many, plants can flowering plants, some of them, they can often self-fertilize, but often it's best to cross-pollinate. Why? Because it increases genetic diversity, and that's a good thing. So bees and a lot of insects are responsible for guaranteeing cross-pollination. So pollinators like bees and insects are really important for the success of flowering plants. In fact, insects co-evolved with flowering plants. Flowering plants evolved at the same time as insects. So what I'm saying is that basically these two groups, insects and flowering plants, their success goes hand in hand with each other because they both helped each other in this process of being able to survive. Okay? And then finally, seeds. What is a seed? A seed is a plant embryo packaged within a food source, or with a food source, with a protective coat. And it basically allows the embryo to remain dormant until environmental conditions are favorable. So, plants can drop their seeds and get covered by snow or get buried, and then it freezes and it's okay, right? Ultimately, those plant seeds, if it warms up enough, eventually they will develop into a plant. Okay. The other thing about seeds, and ultimately with seeds comes fruit. We're going to talk about that too. Is these seeds and fruit offer a reward. Okay. So other than just sort of relying on water and wind to maybe move seeds, then there's all kinds of creative ways. There's all kinds of different ways. Think about dandelions, the little poofy material that picks up that dandelion seed, and the wind will move it. Think about those helicopters from willow trees, that disperses seeds. There's all kinds of creative ways that plants have evolved. One of the other things that they've really evolved, if you will, is relying on animals for dispersal of seeds. So the seed itself, right? You guys eat sunflower seeds and things like that, peanuts. They're a protein source, right? They are a food source. So some animals will eat these seeds whole, okay? Or some animals will eat the fruits that will surround seeds. Well, when they eat these seeds can often survive their trip through the digestive tract. And then eventually animals go somewhere else. Birds, animals, they'll eat the food, they'll eat the fruit, they'll eat the seed, and then they go somewhere else. So they might go 1 mile, they might go 20 miles, they might go 50 miles, whatever. But eventually that animal is going to poop, right? And those seeds can make their way through the digestive tract. And now that seed has survived its trip through the digestive tract. It can lay dormant, and now it's been distributed. So this is one of the ways that plants have pretty ingeniously evolved to offer a reward so animals will eat them and take them somewhere else. It's pretty cool when you start to think about it, okay? All right, so we've kind of looked at all this. All right, so, and then one last little kind of note on plant nutrition, and then we'll keep moving along here. So plants need to absorb a variety of nutrients. So when we talked about xylem and phloem, right, we talked about, the phloem is responsible for transporting nutrients, right? The root system is going to be responsible for absorbing these nutrients, especially from the soil. Plants need to absorb a variety of nutrients, most particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay, these are kind of, and again, this table isn't meant for you guys to sit here and memorize it, but it's just these are mineral elements that are required by plants. You'll see nitrogen and phosphorus are kind of the two biggies here. Okay, that are at the top. And there's other nutrients that plants require that they can obtain from the soil, but nitrogen and phosphorus are kind of the two big ones. Why? Because nitrogen and phosphorus are used to build proteins, nucleic acids, ATP, phospholipid. Oh, what do you know? This is all things that are really super important for cells, right? You need proteins to build cells and maintain all cell functions. Nucleic acids, those are important because they hold the master plan for everything. ATP, wow, that's the energy source for everything, right? Phospholipids, that makes up all cell membranes, right? So these are kind of the biggies, right? For good reason, because of what their function is. So nitrogen and phosphorus are sort of the big two. And plants have and rely often, especially for nitrogen, on nitrogen fixing bacteria. It's something we've kind of mentioned before. But in the soil, there are bacteria, prokaryotic cells, that are good at converting into gas, nitrogen gas from our atmosphere, into ultimately a usable form of nitrogen in the form of nitrates or ammonium, sorry, okay? So that plants can't just breathe in nitrogen gas, just like we can't breathe in nitrogen gas and go, ooh, that's great. To use that nitrogen to build things, build materials and molecules within our cells. So they rely on these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and often within the soil. But often some plants will actually have root nodules that house these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Like corn is an example of plants that will have these sort of nodules all over these roots. These nodules are filled with bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These corn has developed a symbiotic relationship with this. These bacterial cells, the bacterial cells provide nitrogen, fixed nitrogen for them to use. The plant provides some sugar and carbohydrate that it's building within its leaves and shipping to its roots. Okay, so these root nodules that are housed that fix nitrogen. And then even furthermore, we learned about in our last section of notes, mycorrhizae, right? Kind of a fun word to say again. But mycorrhizae are fungus that will work in with root structures that will increase the surface area, so SA surface area, for absorption of more water, absorption of more dissolved nutrients within that water from the soil to be able to help with the nutrition and requirements of the plant. And now, in fact, it's springtime right now, and one of these next 2 weekends, I'm gonna fertilize my lawn, right? If any of your parents ever fertilize their lawn, you go to the Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, and you buy a couple bags of fertilizer, right? What's in that, right? What's in that is primarily nitrogen and phosphorus, right? Even like Miracle-Gro that you put in your watering can that you put on your garden. What is in those fertilizers? Primarily nitrogen and phosphorus, because these are the two main and primary nutrients that plants require to grow, survive, and maintain sort of proteins, DNA, and fats and lipids that make up their cells. Okay, so pretty cool. All right. So if I was watching the video right now, maybe that's kind of a good place to, right now would be kind of a good place to maybe pause if you guys want to take a break, and come back to this later. Okay, 3, 2, 1. I also paused recording because I needed to take a little bit of a break. So back at it. So now we're going to look at and kind of survey and talk a little bit about kind of diversity and different characteristics within the plant world. Okay? So the plant kingdom itself is made up of roughly maybe about 300,000 species or so. And it breaks down into 4 main phyla. Remember from the taxonomic levels of organization from earlier this year, it goes domain, then kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So domain is eukaryotic domain, so eukaryotic cells. Kingdom is the plant kingdom. And then phyla or phylum is the next level of sort of organization. And it divides into 4 areas: mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So mosses are the most primitive of plants. They have no seeds or no vascular tissue, and they're dependent completely on the water and the environment. So they have no ability to sort of transport water. And the only way that they can reproduce is through water or aquatic movement, if you will, the movement of water. So mosses are, the kind of the furry, fuzzy plants that you might find on the forest floor, or maybe they're living on sort of this shaded. You're not going to see them out in the hot, open sun. So these are the most primitive of plants. And mosses and ferns were kind of the first 2 types of plants to evolve within our history of our planet. Ferns is sort of the next step in complexity. And again, even though we're primitive, I always I hesitate using that, because I think that when you hear primitive, it means people think that means, well, less complex, less successful. That's not true. I mean, there are many, many types of mosses, and they are quite successful and have evolved a way of life that is quite successful for them, that works really well. It's just that, we kind of use that word primitive because some of the first plants that evolved on our planet were things like mosses and ferns. Okay. All right, now sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent there, but back to the transition from mosses to ferns. Ferns, what's the difference maker here? Still no seeds, right? But now they have a vascular system. So, we start to see ferns growing up and away from the ground. They're able to absorb water and nutrients through and move that water and nutrients through their vascular system among and between all the parts of the plant. Now, this is a big deal because, again, it's starting to move towards, or I should say, move away from having to be stuck in an aquatic environment, right? And we'll have some more discussion about that in just a minute. And then the next 2, kind of the 2 probably large, not the kind of, but the 2 largest groups within plants are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Gymnosperms are conifers or coniferous plants. These are pine trees. Okay, they produce naked seeds within cones. So the seeds don't have like the same seed coating or protective coat, and the cone itself will sort of burst open and release these seeds. And how do I say it? They don't produce fruits either, right? And that's kind of the big difference here between gymnosperms and angiosperms, is that the angiosperms are the flowering plants. So the angiosperms have evolved flowers. Flowers are a structure that are very specific for reproduction. And then not only that, angiosperms will produce or create a fruit that furthermore surrounds the seed. And I want you to keep this in your mind, but what are fruits? Fruits are basically kind of a reward. They're a reward or a trick to get animals to come to and feed on ultimately those seeds and disperse and move those seeds. Okay. So it's pretty cool when you start to think about that. So all the cool fruits that we eat and really love, and from apples to oranges to bananas to all these sort of different things, it really is a evolutionary trick in some sense that plant, not trick, but an evolutionary advantage, because plants want to move their seeds around. Okay, so let's just sort of a look at. So again, mosses, non-vascular, right? Totally, really a plot or kind of tied to aquatic environments. And then we have seedless vascular plants like ferns, and then the gymnosperms, so pine trees, right? The conifers, and then angiosperms are the flowering plants. So it's sort of the steps to which sort of plant evolution took place for non-vascular, tied a little bit more to aquatic environments or very moist environments. Then we start to see vascular tissue evolving. Then we start to see some sort of way of creating seeds and dispersal of seeds in the form of cones. And then finally flowering plants, creating seeds and fruits to further disperse their seeds. All right. So what we're going to do right now, and to be honest with you, we're going to spend a little bit more time here, right, within the angiosperms, the flowering plants, because they are kind of the largest section of these four phyla. They make up sort of the largest amount, and again, partly because of their reproductive success in terms of fruit development has helped them to evolve and become more successful, in addition to their coevolution with that of insects. The role that insects have played have kind of sort of blown up this section of the plant kingdom. So I should say, blown up this phyla of the plant kingdom, right? So let's talk a little bit about sort of the flower structure and look at this right now. Again, the flower is it's exclusively for the purpose of really reproduction, the parts of the flower, and it also it's usually, flowers are usually brightly colored, right? They provide a reward to hopefully get insects and pollinators to come to them, right? So flowers are brightly colored, so they're visible. That's so they're visible helps so insects actually see them and come to them. Second is flowers will often produce some sort of nectar or reward, really, to get pollinators to come to them. And that way, then these pollinators come to them, and unknowingly, the pollinators, like bees, they're like, hey, this is great. I get a meal, and who cares if I get covered in all this dusty material, blah, whatever. And then they go to the next flower, 100 yards down the road, okay? And now that that pollen is being moved and cross-pollinated from one plant to the next. So flowers are a pretty unique structure when you start to think about them in terms of sort of the jobs that they hold. So it's a plant organ, has specific function in reproduction, as we just said. There are kind of four main parts to it. There's the stamen, the carpel, the fruit, and the seed. Okay, so the stamen is the male part of the flower, where sperm is produced in the form of pollen. That's the dusty material. Okay. So lily pollen, so the stamen, it's this sort of dusty material, right? This is the stamen producing lots and lots of pollen, right? And then the carpel is the female part of the flower, and it contains the ovaries and the ovules. So the carpel is made up of the stigma, style, and ovary. So the stigma is sort of the sticky part that will pollen will stick to. The sperm cell from the pollen is released, travels its way through the style to fertilize the the ovules, the eggs within the ovary, and the ovary is this entire structure. Okay, and these ovules that are fertilized would eventually develop into seeds, and then the ovary will end up developing into the fruit. Okay, so here's those, again, the stamen, the male part of the flower, the anther, and the filament. The anther is the pollen producing portion, right? And the filament sort of connects to the base of this whole connection point within the flower itself. Okay. So carpel is the female part. Fruit is the ripened ovary of the flower. We just said that. Its job is to protect and disperse seeds. And the seed is the fertilized ovule that turn into embryos. And it protects and disperses the embryo as well. Okay, so the ovules, when they're fertilized, turn into seeds. The ovary will ripen, okay, and then turn into the fruit of the plant. So think of an apple, right? An apple is a type of fruit, right? So the seeds within an apple, right, are produced in a flower of an apple, okay? And the apple, the part that you eat, that's the ovary, right? That's that sort of ripened portion of the female part of the plant that has, and so the plant is moving carbohydrate, right? The stuff that tastes good to eat with apples into that spot to thicken that material. And again, what is it? What are fruits? Fruits are a reward, right? The flowers are flashy, and then the fruits are a reward to get things to eat them. And then if they eat them, the seeds will move, right? So like we talked about. So there's all kinds of different fruits. And I'm not expecting you guys to memorize this, but the reason why I'm showing it is sort of just to offer some uniqueness on different fruit types that you're familiar with, like pea pods and raspberries and pineapples and apples. Why do these different fruits look the way that they do? They look the way that they do because a lot of times it's based upon the shape of the carpels and the ovaries within, or I should say really the flower that it comes from. So like a pineapple comes from this like super, this inflorescence. It's basically a bunch of little kind of tiny flowers, right? Micro flowers almost, okay, that make up this whole conglomerate. And the consequence is that the pineapple, when that overall fruit, it makes what's called a multiple fruit because it comes from multiple flowers. A thing like a strawberry or a raspberry, the fruit is kind of like, it's got those little kind of, I don't even know how to describe them, like they're called fruitlets, okay? But what does that come from? It comes from that in a raspberry or strawberry flower, it's got hundreds and hundreds of these little carpels, right? So it's not just one, it's not just one carpel developing into one fruit. It's got hundreds of these carpels, and it makes for what's called an aggregate fruit, okay? And whereas, like, now compare that to an apple, an apple is kind of similar to this. It's, it's a single carpel develops into a single fruit with just that ovary around the outside of it, okay? All right, so now last kind of part of today is talking a little bit about, and a lot of what we just got done talking about really has much to do with allowing plants to have evolved, and as being as successful as they are, and ultimately becoming land plants, right? Plants have overtaken, right, our surface, and that's a good thing, right, for what we've learned, right? Because plants are responsible for taking sunlight, putting into fixed energy that can be consumed by other organisms. Okay? So this process of how did plants get on land? Okay, this is really a big deal, and much of the kind of the things we just got done talking about have alluded to much of this. So here we go. Plants evolved from green algae, right? Algae is this sort of wishy-washy green leafy material that is aquatic. It lives completely within an aquatic environment. Okay, it does all of its sort of fluid and gas exchange within its aquatic environment. It doesn't have roots because it can just absorb water and material from the water that it sits in. It doesn't have stems and, you know, all this sort of crazy cell wall structure. It's got a cell wall, but it's much more loosely constructed because it doesn't need to support itself. It basically floats kind of freely in water. So algae eventually evolved into plants. But in order to algae eventually evolved into land plants. In order for plants to live on land, there's kind of 4 big challenges though, okay? Obtaining resources from air and soil, transport of materials from cell to cell, maintaining moisture, and then reproduction. So we've kind of answered a little bit how plants overcame these challenges, these 4 big challenges. The first is obtaining resources from air and soil. Well, how does it do that? Land plants have evolved roots and leaves. Roots are responsible for absorbing water and nutrients from the soil. Leaves are responsible for absorbing sunlight energy and converting it through photosynthesis into carbohydrate. The transport of materials from cell to cell. Plants had developed a vascular system, and that's xylem and phloem that moves materials from roots to leaves and leaves to roots. Okay? Plants have to maintain moisture. So these stomata, they open and close to regulate water loss. But also plants have what's called a cuticle, right? A cuticle is sort of a waxy covering, right? So this sort of cuticle or waxy covering that covers up plant leaves. If you ever take a plant leaf, right? A live plant leaf, and kind of like, rub it between your fingertips. It feels waxy, right? It feels smooth, because plants will produce their own sort of waxy material that's water resistant to prevent water loss. And then finally, the biggest, one of the big hurdles was to reproduce on land was how do you get, pollen or sperm from one plant to the next? If you're in an aquatic environment, the movement of water helps with that. Well, on land, you don't necessarily have water or rolling or moving water. So the production of pollen, right? Pollen is in numerous amounts. It's small enough and protected enough that it can travel great distances through wind, and then cross-pollinate and increase genetic diversity through that respect, okay? All right, so again, just kind of a compare algae versus land plants. Algae, they don't have roots. They have just sort of hold fast. Water really does the supporting for them. The whole plant is responsible for performing photosynthesis, absorbing water and gas exchange. Land plants, they got roots, right? The roots are responsible for absorbing water and nutrients. The stem, okay, it supports the plant. It offers a sort of a bridge between roots and leaves to roots. And then the leaves are responsible most primarily for photosynthesis, creating carbohydrate that it can move to the stem and the roots, okay? Now, a couple last words on plant reproduction. Plants can produce sexually and asexually. So sexually, we've kind of, from this concept, you guys got a picture of what that means, right? Pollen grains land on flowers. The sperm cells within the pollen grain will fertilize the eggs within the ovary. And now we have sexual reproduction in which we have, 2 parents, 2 different plants that have cross-pollinated. Now, don't get me wrong, plants can also self-fertilize. That is possible. And that's an evolutionary advantage, because then at least, even though you can't shuffle the genetic deck, at least then you guarantee that something is going to be produced. Some offspring are being produced, so that plant is in order to survive. So that's pretty cool when you start to think about how plants can do that. Okay. The other way is, again, asexual reproduction, vegetative reproduction. What does that kind of mean? Plants, many plants can use like cuttings from them. So you can take a cutting of the plant. So you might have a plant that has, a bunch of leaves off it. You can cut a little piece off, and you can plant that little piece in the soil, and it'll eventually grow into the same plant. Okay. And that same plant would be genetically identical. Like my grandmother had like a spider plant that my dad had took a cutting from, and that cutting was then grown into a plant that still exists to this day, right? So it's kind of cool. Other thing that they'll do in terms of stems and roots can act as clones to begin growth of new plants. So strawberries are notorious for this. What they'll do is they have these sort of types of roots that will shoot out horizontally, and they'll kind of lay these sort of what are called nodes down, and a new plant will develop off of these sort of side shoots, okay, or they're called runners. And these new plants then will establish themselves as their own plant. And it's a form of sort of vegetative reproduction that happens in the wild or naturally without anybody doing any cutting or manipulating. So strawberry plants are notorious for this. They'll produce what are called runners. And that runner buds off into new genetically identical plants. Okay. All right. Then last, which is kind of, I think it's always kind of a fun discussion to have at the end. There are certainly atypical plants, meaning atypical, meaning different, strange, unusual, whatever you want to say. There are carnivorous plants and there are parasitic plants. Okay. So carnivorous plants are going to be usually, why are they do not obtain nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil. They can photosynthesize, right? But they are unable to absorb nitrogen and phosphorus correctly, or can't absorb nitrogen and phosphorus the same way that other plants do through the soil. So what do they do about it? They do it by consuming organisms, right? So, the most famous one is the Venus flytrap, right? So they consume organisms. So let's take a look at this little short video, right? So there's that lady beetle or ladybug that's kind of unsuspecting. There's the hairs on the internal surface of the Venus flytrap, and old ladybug ends up walking into it. The movement on those hairs triggers a change in shape, and there she goes, right? So now that plant is able to sort of latch down. It consumes and excretes its own enzymes. It's going to break down that insect, and nitrogen and phosphorus from that insect then can be absorbed by the Venus flytrap, as opposed to drawing it from the soil. So it's obtaining nitrogen and phosphorus by carnivorizing, really almost in a way hunting, in a sense, other organisms. And then parasitic plants, these are so difference, carnivorous plants do produce sugar versus via photosynthesis. Parasitic plants are plants that really do not perform photosynthesis. They obtain sugar and other nutrients by tapping into a host plant's vascular system. So an example of that is mistletoe. So mistletoe, right? Christmas time underneath the mistletoe, right? Mistletoe, if you're on river's edges and stuff like that, you see these big kind of funky clumps of green leafy material. Mistletoe is a parasitic plant that will really inject itself or inject its way into the vascular tissue of the host plant and draw water and material and carbohydrate from the plant. Okay? And then one last example, pitcher plants. These pitcher plants are actually, the reason why I put these on here is that pitcher plants are found around here. You don't really find Venus flytraps around here. Mistletoe is a little bit further south for the most part. But pitcher plants are common and I guess not super common, but can be found in this area. The pitcher plant has some water in the base of it. And it's kind of colorful, and what happens is in that water, it also secretes enzymes, digestive enzymes. Insect kind of makes its way. It goes, ooh, what's in here, I wonder? Insect goes in, ends up falling into the base of the pitcher plant, gets stuck in the water and fluid in the bottom, and then slowly gets digested by the enzymes that the pitcher plant produces. So pitcher plants are found in the upper Midwest, and you can find them around here. They don't clamp down like the Venus flytrap does, but it's somewhat the same concept. It traps those insects for the purpose of attaining nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay. All right. And then last, and then we'll get out of here, guys. We've talked about plants, their important role, right? They're the bridge between free energy and fixed energy. They are the reason why we have, carbohydrate to consume. So we obviously have a humongous dependence upon plants and their existence. Okay. Obviously they are a food source. So grains and vegetables, right? Even the seeds and fruits themselves too, right? I like apples, right? So they are a food source. Plants are feed for livestock. Livestock, cows and pigs and things like that we farm and use to produce the meats that we consume. Okay. Plants are important for the purpose of producing pharmaceuticals. The vast majority of pharmaceutical drugs and things like that we use to treat illnesses come from plant sources. Okay. Plants are used in clothing, so cotton, right? Cotton clothes, building materials, wood for building materials, different household products, right? Things like cleaning products that have different, acids that come from plant sources and things like that. Okay. So there's all kinds of really sort of applications and uses for plants, right? Beyond just the fact that, yes, they photosynthesize and things like that. Okay. But, and this kind of goes back to our unit on, on ecology and climate change and things like that. The reality of it is that right now, as we stand, about 70% of plant species are currently at threat for extinction. With climate change, and especially the threat of climate change and how it's changing our tropical rainforests, where we house the largest sort of percentage of the biomass of all plant species on our planet, they're threatened, right? So there is certainly a call for understanding about how we need to preserve and understand the role that this particular group of organisms play. And I'll say it, right, kind of, so goes the plants on our planet, so goes really the rest of the living things on our planet, because they are so critical in bridging that gap between free sunlight, right, and our ability to be able to have energy for ourselves, at least from a human perspective. If there's not plants in the middle here, right, really it means that there's the inability for lots of different living organisms to survive. Okay. So it's a bit of a call, it's a bit of a understanding, it's a bit of understanding the role. I hope you guys understand the role that plants play, and to take it for granted a little bit less. The plants around us on our planet are certainly as important, if not really one of the most important living organisms on our planet in terms of the role that they play in bridging this gap. Okay. All right. Well, that's it, guys. Just to remind you again, this lecture here, if you split it apart in a couple of days, that's fine. Remember, Thursday, you guys have the quiz tomorrow, and that online review is due tomorrow. And then that is it. So we'll see you guys. Thanks again. And let me know if you got any questions. You guys know where to find me.